What is up, everybody? Phil here, and welcome to KO Gaming's first major video game review of 2017. You know, gamers worldwide have been intrigued by Resident Evil 7 Biohazard ever since its first playable demo, called Beginning Hour, was released during E3 of 2016. A unique first-person perspective, being the first time this was ever used in the Resident Evil series, in addition to an emphasis on exploration and puzzle solving rather than survival horror-style combat, really left gamers scratching their heads. Was this really what Resident Evil 7 is going to be? Because it is certainly nothing like this series has been in the past, and is certainly nothing like the evolution of the game through Resident Evils 4 through 6, which were more run-and-gun action-adventure games than true survival horror. And so, for over 6 months, we've all been waiting through multiple different versions of this demo that were released to find out exactly what the final version of the game was going to be. The game finally released this week. I just completed it, and I'm ready to share my thoughts on Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Now, for clarification's sake, I just want to let you know I do own PlayStation VR, and I did play Resident Evil 7 on my PS4, but I did not use VR for my first playthrough, and that's not what I'm reviewing in this game review. Reason being is because I found that the field of view with virtual reality is incredibly narrow and actually hinders the initial gameplay experience. I wanted to get the full breadth of the game without using VR for my first run through, and also the graphics are dramatically downscaled when using virtual reality in order to get the frame rate necessary for the virtual reality effect to work, and I didn't want to give my viewers an inferior version of this game as the first initial run through. Now, in the future, I may actually do a VR run through of the game, but for now, this is just a review of the plain vanilla version on the PlayStation 4. The story of Resident Evil 7 starts off with the protagonist Ethan receiving a mysterious video message from his estranged wife. Mia, his wife, has been missing for 3 years and was actually presumed dead by authorities, and this is the first that anyone's ever heard of her. This message tells Ethan to stay away, but also includes a cryptic address somewhere out in Louisiana, which Ethan is now compelled to locate and find. He wants to know what happened to his wife, and so, against all advice, he sets off for himself to find this mysterious location. Of course, in real life, this would make absolutely no sense. You'd probably notify the authorities, but being that this is a horror game, you're just going to have to suspend your disbelief. Ethan shows up in the bayou and immediately starts running into some mysterious things. There's a van that seems to be completely abandoned. There's a mansion that's completely protected by a fence, and no one seems to be around. And so Ethan begins to kind of investigate the estate, leading into the main plot of the game. I won't spoil too much, since the plot of this game is one of the major things you're going to enjoy, in my opinion, but it just keeps up that very creepy atmosphere that you saw in the Beginning Hour demo. You'll be investigating houses, guest houses, shacks, docksides, a big mansion, and then there's actually a couple other locations outside of this main location in Louisiana that you will investigate. I'm not going to really spoil too much about that, but just to let you know, there is a variety. It's not like you're just stuck inside the same house for the 9.5-hour run that it's probably going to take you to complete Resident Evil 7, and that's a good thing. Yes, there is going to be exploration, and yes, there actually is puzzle solving, incredibly similar to that was in the original trilogy of Resident Evil games. You'll be looking for special keys, items, plaques, and things that'll open up locked doors. You'll be looking for secret passages. There'll be puzzles that you need to solve to get items that are otherwise hidden, and so it really does have a major throwback feel to the original Resident Evil games. In addition, the game does have some combat and gunplay, and yeah, it's very different than anything else in the series because it's from a first-person perspective, but I will tell you this, there is a limited amount of ammo in the game, and yes, it could be very tense if you don't have healing items and enough ammo at one time when you're taking on a gauntlet of enemies that seem to come out of nowhere. It really can be just suspenseful and disheartening and scary as hell. There's jump scares, but it's also that feeling of uneasiness that you had in that original trilogy of Resident Evil games, where you never knew what was around the next corner. You didn't know if you had enough ammo or supplies to take it on. It's back in full force in Resident Evil 7, and that's a great thing. Now, outside of just Ethan and his wife Mia, the main antagonists of the game are the Blake family. That's right, that Southern American down-home group of creepy-looking relatives that we've seen in all the promotional materials up to this point in the game. It's obviously there's something wrong with the Blakes here. There's not just crazy, there's something maybe even supernatural or undermining in them that's making them do absolutely crazy things, sometimes possibly even against their will, as sometimes they'll seem to be almost friendly, and then other times they're coming after you with a bloodthirsty rage to want to rip your head off. So it's pretty nuts that at any time you could see one of this family just show up and scare the bejesus out of you. You don't know when you're going to have to fight them or run from them. And again, it's kind of that fight or flight confusion that leads to the suspense and the creepiness of Resident Evil 7. A lot of the times you won't know if you're supposed to be upright fighting someone or just running from them, and it's cool to have that feeling of tenseness, maybe leading to you replaying the same segment 2 or 3 times to actually figure out what you were supposed to do to pass it, and that's pretty cool. Now, there's also other enemies in the game. Yeah, they are kind of generic, although there are different variations of them. They're called the Molded because take a look at them, they look like they're made of mold. And yes, they are kind of interesting. They move similarly to some of the enemies previous in the Resident Evil franchise, including the Ouroboros enemies from some of the other outings, including Resident Evil Revelations, but they are a little bit different. Yes, you can actually deal more damage to them if you actually try to aim for their limbs or their head. And yeah, they kind of walk in a weird way that tends to dodge bullets naturally, making it kind of difficult to even take down one of the weaker ones in the game. So it takes a little bit of practice with the first-person shooting combat in order to get the knack of how to actually hit them properly in order to take them out. A lot of the times it may just behoove you to run by them or find a way around them rather than taking them on head-on, because you're going to expend so much ammo, it's not worth it. So yeah, you do have the Blake family as the big baddies of the game, but there's also other enemies as well. Two things make a return in Resident Evil 7 that have been a staple of the franchise for quite some time. First is inventory management. Especially for the first few hours of this game, you're going to be finding yourself juggling items in and out of item boxes in safe rooms to try to make sure that you have the right items on you at all times. Maybe you found a key, but you haven't found the door for the key yet. Maybe you found one item that you can combine, but you don't have the other thing to combine it with yet, and since you want to take as much ammo or the proper items with you at a certain period of time, inventory management is a big return to Resident Evil 7. It really hasn't been that much of a concern in the last few games, but in this one it very much is. Also, there are several big-time boss fights in the game. Now, I'm purposely not going to spoil these for you because these are some of the best moments of Resident Evil 7. A lot of the times they come out of nowhere and they're shocking at how interesting and different and scary they can be. So I'm not going to spoil, but I'll just let you know there's a few of them in there that are pretty damned awesome. Now, one thing that's new to the series is Gore. Not to say that there hasn't been gore in the past, but this is just kind of the slasher horror gore that you've seen in movies like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's going to be hands chopped off, people getting stabbed, and you're going to be like, oh my god, this game is not for the squeamish. Just to forewarn you, if maybe you were okay with the previous Resident Evil games because they didn't seem like realistic horror, having this game being in the first-person perspective and having people actively attack you is a whole other ball game and something new to the franchise entirely. The graphics are a little bit here and there. What I mean by that is that they're not very consistent throughout the entire game. Whenever you're dealing with characters like the Blake family or Mia, it looks almost photorealistic. This is obviously a really good job of motion capture translated into a game very well in the modern era. But locations in the game can vary greatly. Sometimes you'll walk into a new area and your breath will be taken away at how creepy it is. Look at the lighting effects of things that are reflecting off of the walls. And then other times, it just isn't very impressive at all. In fact, right at the beginning of the game, I took a look into a rock to my right that had almost no textures or any kind of detail on it, and I felt like I was playing a game on the Nintendo 3DS. I get the feeling the reason is because they really dumbed down the graphics of this game to have a smaller field of view and to not be too taxing on the engine so that it could actually work properly with the PlayStation VR. So if anything, the one major trade-off of Resident Evil 7 is that the graphics aren't necessarily the best you've ever seen because they wanted this to work with virtual reality. As long as you're not looking for the most groundbreakingly graphically achieving game ever, this really shouldn't be an issue. The story of Resident Evil 7 is pretty much the best part of it in my opinion. At first you have absolutely no idea what's going on with the Blakes and all of these monsters that are out to get you, but over the course of the game, through the actions of the family, through other occurrences, and of course through the traditional pieces of paper, notebooks, diaries, and text logs that you'll find strewn throughout the locations in the game, you'll be reading a lot and finding out what exactly happened here and how this all came to pass. Now I'm not going to spoil any of it because it is pretty much the best part of the game, but rest assured that by the end, not only are there twists and revelations about it, but it also has a final resolution. Unlike a lot of modern games in this era where they kind of just make you try to figure it out for yourself, Resident Evil 7 has a satisfying ending and actually ties in with the mainstream Resident Evil franchise, which is something that a lot of people were questioning. Gee, would it have a tie to the characters from the previous games? And the answer I have to tell you is yes, it does, which is awesome. It is very much a part of the mainstream Resident Evil plotline, and that's awesome. So, I'm not going to spoil any of the plot points in this review, but just trust me on this fact. I am very skeptical when it comes to the quality of story. I loved the story of Resident Evil 7, and I think that you will too. And so with all these positives, including awesome responsive first-person shooter gameplay, the return to form with classic survival horror elements like limited inventory space and resource management, as well as never knowing what's around that next corner, leading to a feeling of uneasiness and suspense at all times, a unique cast of interesting characters, boss fights, a great story. Obviously, all this adds together to be an awesome gaming experience, but what's not so great about Resident Evil 7? Well, first off, this has to be said. If you have been a fan of the Resident Evil franchise recently, including games like Resident Evil Revelations or Resident Evil 5 or 6, and then you play Resident Evil 7, you might be like, what happened here? Because this game honestly feels nothing like those previous games whatsoever. They totally changed up the feel of the game to be a more survival horror kind of deal rather than a run and gun action adventure shooter, which really is what Resident Evil 6 was at its core. So if you're a hardcore fan of the last few games in the franchise, you may be very disappointed by 7 because they went for something more classic, and it's okay if you're in that boat. Number 2, I do have to admit that this game feels a little bit on the shorter side. Now, not to say that I don't feel the pacing is good, because I think the pacing is excellent. There's never a part in the game that feels like it's dragging on, or it's boring, or that you're doing something that you wish you could just get to the next part. Every part of the game feels well-paced and excellent, so the direction of this game was done very well. But the game's around 9.5 hours long. And in this modern day and era, a lot of us are going to have a hard time swallowing a $60 or whatever full retail price tag it is in your region for a game that you're going to play within a couple sessions and you're probably going to be done with forever. There really isn't much replayability whatsoever in Resident Evil 7, although there are some collectibles in the game that you could go back and try to find. There is an unlockable Madhouse mode that makes it so that there are absolutely no checkpoints whatsoever in the game and you're relying on the original save points just like you used to in the original Resident Evil games. Remember those typewriters and ink ribbons? Yeah, that mechanic returns in the Madhouse difficulty of the game. Yeah, so that maybe has a little bit of replayability, and there's one critical choice that you make during the plot of the game that could lead to a variation on the ending, although I've heard the variation is not a big one and really does not warrant a whole second playthrough to see. Again, 9.5 hours for full retail price could be a hard thing to swallow. The thing is that if they made the game a little bit longer, maybe it would have overstayed its welcome, and maybe it would have been one of those games where it has one of those segments that's more drawn out and it feels like it just is too much for what it wants to be. Maybe for survival horror, that 10-hour kind of hot spot is what you should aim for. I don't know, because I've really never played a super long survival horror game. I think the longest one I've ever really played was Alien Isolation a few years back. That one ran around 13 to 15 hours, and that one also had a few spots where maybe near the end felt like it was dragging on a bit, so maybe this is the perfect length. But I know there's gonna be people who are gonna have issue with a game that only lasts 9.5 hours and you paid full retail price for, especially because, yeah, of course it's Capcom, and I know you were expecting this. There's DLC coming, and it's coming sooner rather than later. In fact, 1 week after the release of the game, there's already a DLC pack that'll be released. Now, the good news is that I've done some research, and it seems the DLC packs for Resident Evil 7 are more kind of periphery content and more supplemental. They're not going to reveal anything new or critical about the plot of the game whatsoever. It's more like if you really enjoyed the gameplay of the game, you can go back and maybe do a prequel kind of scenario for an hour where you're maybe trying to run away from from the Blake family and stuff like that. It doesn't seem like it's going to be anything that if you miss out on it, oh no, you missed out on the full experience of the game. It does seem like it's going to be completely extra and not necessary to play. But again, you might have issue with Capcom nickel and diming us for more content, especially when the main game was only 9.5 hours long. Why the hell are they already selling DLC? That's kind of ridiculous. So, lots of positives tied in with one or two very small negatives leads to Resident Evil 7 being a true return to the original form of the survival horror formula of the series, and overall a pretty damned good game. And so, all factors considered, I score Resident Evil 7 as a 9 out of 10. The first great game of 2017. I think that we're probably going to be hard pressed by the time the end of the year comes to find 10 other games that could maybe knock this out of what will be a top 10 contender for me. But hey, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe this will be one of the most amazing years for gaming we've ever seen. I'm not so sure. But anyway, Resident Evil 7, an amazing experience, a great survival horror experience, a true return to the original form. If you like those original Resident Evil games and you're looking for that kind of heightened suspense and inventory management and survival horror that you've wanted for years and didn't get with the last few Resident Evil games, you're absolutely gonna love 7. And that is it for my review, everyone. I sure hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did, please consider giving this video a like here on YouTube, as well as subscribing to KO Gaming for videos just like this one coming up very frequently over the coming year of 2017. In addition, please check out the video description for a link leading you directly to my raw playthrough of Resident Evil 7 over on my DSP Gaming channel, as well as some other cool stuff, including a Loot Crate referral and discount link, as well as my Patreon. Thanks very much for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time for another awesome review right here on KO Gaming.